Welcome back. So another keyboard video, eh? Well, not really, because the previous video that I uploaded was actually the keyboard video, which you can find right here. The point of this video is to sort of go in depth and review the U4 switches, in which that the full name of it is simply called Outemu U4. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh my god, Outemu, the budget king, in which that shows up on all the retail boards that you can buy for 30 bucks off Amazon. Straight clear, QC's a bitch. And unfortunately, I wish that Stigma wasn't that way, because obviously switches will be cheaper to buy or just are more widely available to put into budget keyboards. But I don't think Outemu itself is really bad. It just has a stigma because it's not originally started off well. Anything that wasn't cherry was bad, and then after a little while it was, oh well, cherry switches can be the household name, and some Chinese ripoffs are great, but Outemu is still bad because it's associated with cheaper mechs with cheaper QCs and overall just cheaper quality, which I think is a damn shame because the this key switches aren't really doing anything wrong. If anything, the blues sound more and feel more clicky than cherry blues, and the tactility in their Outemu browns are ever so slightly more round, so who knows, I guess. But that isn't the point of this video. The point of this video is to discuss U4 and Silent Tactile switches, because the U4 is a direct descendant to the Silent Tactile switches because they were made a year after. The original Silent switches were called Silent Tactile, just simply Outemu Silent Tactile, and they were sold in parts by my good friend Gazzew, or as you may know him on Reddit, Paul, or his username, hbheroinbob. So, what are they, rather? I know for a fact that not many people know what Silent Tactiles are, if not like U4s, because I've heard even less news about the U4. But before we get into what the U4 is, let's talk about the Silent Tactile, because I believe it is very special. Here is a Silent Tactile switch from Outemu, and you can probably tell that it's a kind of an interesting housing because we call this the Outemu Ice. And the stem is actually the magic of pretty much everything that goes on with the switch, because the stem is obviously the thing that silences the key switch. So why is it important? Well, it's important because back then when this was introduced, we still were struggling to find decent switches that rivaled Zeal. Because if you wanted the best silent switches, either you went with scissor switches or you went with Xylent and or the Helios switches that Zeal introduced to the market for the same pricing as every other one of the switches, which is insane. And I know that other people try to compete, such as Alias or even Gatoron, and of course, Cherry were the first ones to do it with the Cherry Silent Red or the Cherry Pinks. But as time went on, Zeal decided to do it better, and of course, they are pretty good at what they do. However, I don't think anyone that has a decent amount of like standard income can spend 87 plus shipping on key switches in order to fill out a keyboard. At least not everyone. It's not widely available. You did have Alias obviously with $5.50 for 10 switches, but they didn't really have a pronounced bump. And I think the major thing that people were complaining about was that it just was a regular silent switch that didn't really distinguish itself from the competition. Well, in comes these guys, the Outemu Silent Tactile. These guys changed up the market, at least in my opinion, even though they were super underrated, because not only did they silence things extremely well, better than the ones that either matched this price or slightly below the price point of the Switch, because pricing on it was around 55 or 65 cents a switch, depending if you bought all the parts or not. The stem itself was only 35 cents from what I can recall, and I think they are still that way now. Either way, it won't break the bank. So not only did the silencing mechanism work extremely well, but the tactility was a lot better than, say, Gatoron Silent Browns or Alias switches. Take a look. So here's the Outemu Silent Tactile. So we have a little bit of travel right before it, and then down. And you can probably tell that this thing is making my finger ricochet. And of course, after that, there's a lot of travel on the bottom, and then the bump, and then the travel before it. To compare to that, let's take a Cherry MX Brown. Let me see if I can find one in my switch collection. Here we go. Pop it out real quick. On the contrary, and I'll also get a Gator on Silent Brown for this, here is a Cherry Brown with a lot of travel, the tiny bump here, and then a lot of forward travel, tiny bump, and then travel. And the same thing for something, say, like Gator on Silent Browns. Here is all the pre-travel, the tiny bump here, and then the travel on the back. You can probably tell that it's not really putting up much of a fight. I know some people like the whisper of tactility, and that's totally fine, but for me, and I think a lot of others, we just thought that these switches had something left to be desired. So why not we try the Aliyah switch that tried to capitalize on that? Well, it failed. Obviously, it didn't really do well. Here's an Aliyah switch. And again, the bump was kind of pathetic. We have the travel, the bump here, and a little bit more travel here. Basically, just kind of like a smoother version of a Gator on Browns. And I don't think it was really worth $5.50. However, I did take apart the switch and use the housing by itself with like cream switches and halo switches, at least the stems of them, because I found out that these are essentially Zeal V1 clones, and if you were to put decently tactile stems into them, they could work in your favor. But of course, nowadays we have things a lot better on offer. So now going back to the Silent Tactiles. So anyone that really took up on them, I think they were pleasantly surprised, and obviously they were only half the price of something, say, Xylence and or Helios. So it was a pretty good choice, although I did not see too much widespread use of it, although those that used it almost always had something positive to say, and I'm glad that is, because these things should be recognized as a valid form of silencing your switches and your keyboard in general, because I think they are perfectly valued switches that aren't too cheap, but aren't too expensive in order for you to put into your keyboard. For example, I have this XD84 in front of me. Now, if I were to make everything a Silent Tactile switch, it would be around $87 to $90 with Xylent or Helios switches. And then if I wanted to use these Outemu Silent Tactile, then it would just be around, let's say, $50 instead. So pretty much half the price. And I really enjoy the fact that these things are just becoming more and more affordable. There's also a silent linear version of this, which was found in the shift key. And here is actually all the silent switches, or at least the custom switches from Outemu. We have the U4 here, Silent Tactile and a Cherry housing. And then we have these Phoenix switches. This is a prototype and this is the release. Basically bringing back the Aristotle switches, except they're more durable. And of course, a low profile click here, the regular Outemu blue, and this 3 silent linears. And again, in my video, I was incorrect. These are no longer offered as of now, but they will be making a return in the future. And they come in all these different weights. And the one I put on my shift key was 48 grams, which was rather light considering everything else is around 62 grams. But I digress. So what is U4 then, if the Silent Tactile is the current switch that I'm highlighting? Well, the U4 is what is another switch that is also a Silent Tactile, except it focuses more on a bigger bump with a more drawn out tactility. So as you notice with the Silent Tactiles, you have a bit of travel here, a bump, and a lot of over travel here. So you can probably tell it's a really sharp drop. And perhaps people that like something, say, like Holy Pandas, maybe they felt a little bit underwhelmed. Perhaps there was something to be desired there. Well, here you are with the U4 switches, which take the tactility to a whole new level. So no longer is there any pre-travel, but the bump is all the way down. Here's the bump. you can tell that the stem goes further into the switch, and then the over travel is greatly reduced. So again, let's compare it side by side. So, albeit this switch is still Silent Tactile, is not as sharp of a tactility compared to the Silent Tactile on the left, but it makes it a little bit more round and more, I don't know. I personally prefer this type of tactility, although I can appreciate the Silent Tactiles as they were in my board for a year before I dismantled it again. I do believe they're around the same price, and don't worry, that bottom housing is exactly the same. It's just a different color from what I recall. So, Gazzew described it as a capital P versus a capital D. A capital D would be representative of the U4 tactility, where it's like a really round top to bottom tactility, versus a capital P, which is a silent tactile, that's a bit of a sharper, more jutted out beginning tactility with a bit more travel at the end. So where does this leave us? Well, we now have two switches that cater to two audiences that like their tactilities. One, shorter but sharper, which is the original Silent Tactile, and the one that's more drawn out and more round, which is the U4 switch. Now, I understand that there are some complaints about the keyboard. I do know that some people don't necessarily like the Outemu housing on the bottom, which arguably I think also is a bit of a problem, although I don't think it's much of an issue myself. However, when I rebuilt this keyboard on stream, I noticed a lot of people were kind of wondering what that noise was. And here, I'll play a little bit of a clip for you right now.
Fuck. It's pingy because that's actually the switch. It's the switch and not the keyboard itself. Like I think it's the stem hitting the tactile leaf. I probably didn't loop some of these switches, but this is just par for the course.
So what this is that it's the stem going against the contact leaf. At least I think that's what it is, because of the fact that it's so quiet. And some people really didn't like that weird kind of pingy spring noise, even though it's actually not the spring, but it's just the stem rubbing up against the contacts. Now, I haven't experimented much. However, I know for a fact that the stem can be used obviously in different switches. Otherwise, what's the point, right? When it comes to the switches that I showed off earlier, again, this was a silent tactile stem inside a cherry housing, and this was the regular ice. And you can probably hear that it's kind of having this kind of ping noise. Take a listen. And the cherry housing, not much. So if you really must get your switches silenced, but you just, for some reason, absolutely cannot stand that sort of weird pingy noise, then I suppose you can just grab the stems off of hbheroinbob slash Gazzew slash Paul to save yourself not only a little bit of money, but perhaps maybe even a better experience for you as a person who would enjoy a good tactile silent switch. So where does this leave us? Again, we have two choices given to the person that wants to buy a tactile switch that won't break the bank. And, well, I don't really necessarily think there's much else to say. Two of these switches are going to be accompanied with some silent linears coming back in the future. At least that's what I heard from Paul himself. And these are currently going for, I think, each stem goes for 35 cents or something. And in total, the entire switch costs no more than 65 cents. So do yourself a favor and at least check these out. Oh, and just one more Just one more pointer. The sound differences with Silent Tactiles and U4 is pretty much non-distinguishable. They should sound the same. As a matter of fact, here is an old clip of me typing on my old, previously modded Varmilomia Pro with Silent Tactiles in it, and I'll compare it to the footage that I recorded for yesterday's video. Take a listen. So there you have it. That's all I got about these. In total, or in all rather, I think these are great value switches that really serve a purpose in terms of what they serve to do, which is silencing your key switches and your keyboard overall. Do I think these switches are for everybody? Of course not. This entire hobby revolves around preference and what you want to put in your keyboard. However, I honestly think these things are underrated and they should probably get more media coverage in terms of what they offer and how they can compete with the more name brand switches such as Cherry and Zeal. So that's it. Leave any questions you have for me in the comments and I'll be sure to get back to them. And don't forget that I will continue to make the... Oh shit, I actually have 300 subscribers now. Ah, fuck.